Whichever way you want to slice it and dice it, authentication is hard. And it's also one of the fundamentals that you want to make sure that you get right with your application from the outset. This is why we should always try and leverage a utility library or a framework wherever we can for authentication. Nuxt.auth is a good example of this, but it's so much more. It's an authentication broker, a client library to make front-end interaction easier, and a server-side library to assist you in creating a backend for front-end. Let's go take a look. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. So let's go and have a look at Nuxt.auth with Nuxt3. So I've got here just the starting project already built. So we need to go and install Sidebase Nuxt.auth, and we need to install it as a developer tool. So that's given us our dev dependency of Nuxt.auth. So to add that into our Nuxt project, we need to go into our Nuxt config and add that in as a module. And then we need to go and create our handler. So the way that we can do that is in the server directory, we can create an API folder and an auth folder, and we can create a catch-all handler for this. So we need to import auth from the auth library, and then we need to implement that Nuxt.auth handler. And then in my case, I'm using Azure B2C. So out of the box, if we go and look at the docs, what we find out is that Nuxt.auth is actually built on top of Next.auth. So if we go and look at the Next.auth documentation, we go into the providers, we can see that these are all the providers that we can connect to out of the box. In my case, I'm using Azure B2C, and I've got my Azure B2C instance already set up because I've used it in other videos. So inside here, I've got some users that I can use, and I've also got some user flows that enable me to sign in. So let's jump back over to the code. What we need to do in here is import the right provider that we're going to use. So in my case, it's Azure B2C. So I import the Azure B2C and I set up a const where my configuration can live. So inside this configuration object, I need to set up the tenant ID of my B2C instance, the client ID, client secret that I've already set up, the flow that I'm using, which is a sign-in only flow. I'm not allowing users to sign up. And then the parameters that I want to actually use, which is the OpenID and the offline access, so that I get a token as well. And then we need to enable PKCE for this to work. And we need to set this client token endpoint auth method to none. So then inside the handler, I can set up the providers to point to that instance that I just set up, or that constant that I just set up there. And that is all we need to do. So there are a few gotchas in there around setting B2C up correctly with the correct parameters and bits and pieces. So it's never straightforward, but with a bit of debugging and going around the loop and a bit of Googling, you can find all of this kind of information out. So let's go and create a component where we can encapsulate all of our auth functionality. So I'm going to have a script setup section in here, and this use session is a composable that the authentication library gives us, and out of that we can get some nice properties and methods that we can call. So the status tells us whether or not the user is logged in, and we can call a couple of methods for signing in and signing out. So that's a nice easy to use set of functionality. So let's go and add our template in, and inside this div we can just do an h1 and we check if the status is set to authenticated, which is what it gets set to. Then we can get some information out of the data which tells us who this particular user is, so we can get the user's name, for instance. And to go with that if, we need a velse, so not logged in our case. And then we need a button or a couple of buttons, one for if we are already logged in. So again, we're checking the authenticated status. And so if that's the case, we set up a button with logout in it, and we call the sign out method. that we imported up here, so it will call that method there. And then we have another button, which again is a v-else on this. So if we're not logged in, then we have a login button, and in that case we call the sign in function. So let's add that component into our app.view. In fact, I'm just going to capitalize that just to be consistent. So that's added that in. So now we can do an npm run dev, run this up and see what we get. Okay, we've got an error, can't find account. Let's change that to components. Let's try that again. Okay, so that's given us a different error. So let's follow this next auth errors JWT session error. Let's see what that tells us. Let's go and make sure that we've got the node Jose tools installed, and let's copy that. Okay, that seems to be up and running. So let's jump over to our app. That's given us a big error saying use session is not defined. And so in our account, rather than use session, which is what it used to be, they've changed that in later versions. So it's now use auth. So let's just quickly fix that up. And there we are. We are currently not logged in and we have our login button. So let's go and click on that and we see our provider that we've set up. So we can sign in with Azure Active Directory B2C. I can come over here, enter my B2C credentials, and there we are. I am now logged in as administrator and I have my logout button correctly working, and that is a complete OpenID Connect round trip to Azure B2C up and running. So if I want to get rid of that intermediate screen where the user has to click on Azure B2C, I can take them straight across. So I can do that in the sign in. And if we have a look at it, we can see that I can provide the provider. So I can do that just using Azure AD B2C. Save that. Let's try that login again. And now I jump straight to the Azure B2C sign in. So that provides a slightly slicker experience for my user, which is good. So what else can we do with this? So if you want to see more about what's actually going on under the covers, then inside the handler here, there is this debug setting. So we can set that to true. And then when that hot reloads, if I log out and log in again, this will just do the whole round trip, but without me entering the credentials because I've already entered them in this browser session. If I jump back over here, we can see that we see a whole load of trace coming out of Next Auth around all sorts of things. So the URL that we went to and what our verifier was, all sorts of useful stuff. So when you experience OpenID Connect issues, which invariably you will do because it's a bit of a devil to set up in the first place, then this would be a good place to enable your debug so that you can start wading through and understanding what you sent across and what they sent you back, etc. It's also useful here because you can see the claims that come back. So against the OAuth profile here, this is what comes back from Azure B2C in my case. So I can see that the name is administrator. I can see I get this emails claim, which has got their email address in it. I've got some extension user permissions because I've set up some extension API properties on my Azure B2C instance. So that comes back with some user properties in there. So all of this stuff you can get back and you can start manipulating and doing extra stuff with, as we'll see in a minute. So how would we handle authorization? Now that we've got authentication working, how can we handle authorization? So as I've said, you could use the Azure B2C extension mechanism and provide an API where you manipulate the claims and you pass those extra claims back. So you'd have to add an extra API method in here that your Azure B2C instance could call back into. I've got a video on how to set all of that up, so I'll put a link to that video up above. But the easiest way to do it is to actually implement a callback inside of this handler here. So after the providers, there is this callbacks object. And inside here, there are some methods that we can override for the various aspects of the setting up of all of these tokens and session objects and such. So one of those is this JWT method that we can override. So we can do an async JWT, and we can accept the token, the account, and the profile. And the profile is what we're seeing down here, so that we know we've got this emails property on it, but we'll get to that. So inside of here, this is the method that gets called to set up any custom claims and that kind of thing that you want on your JWT token that's passed around inside of this framework. So what we can do is we can check if the account and the profile are both set, so everything's worked okay. Then on the token itself, we can set up a new property called roles and assign user into that as an array. And then what we can do is we can check the profile, and if in the emails property it finds a value that contains admin, so i.e. in this case here it will find admin, then we can push an additional role into our JWT token of admin. So anyone with admin in their email address is a user and an admin, everyone else is just a user. Bit of a contrived example, but hey, there we go. Once we've done that, we just need to return the token, which then satisfies that method. And we'll get to all these red squigglies in a while, but ignore those for now. The other method that we're going to override inside here is after we've done the async JWT, we can override the session, which is the method that gets called to actually set up the session information that we want stored down for our particular user. So here we can accept, like we did above, the session for this user. We can accept the token that we set up just a minute ago in that previous JWT piece, and we can also accept the current logged on user. So any information that the framework knows about the user is returned in there. And then inside this method, we can just do session.user.roles equals token.roles. And we return the session out of this. Now let's go and have a look at these red squigglies. So we've got lots of horrible red squigglies saying things are undefined and that doesn't exist on that type. So how do we fix up all of these types? So let's create a new folder called types. And inside that folder, let's create a next auth. So careful, next auth.d.ts. So we're going to override or augment the types that next auth has out of the box. So to do this, we need a couple of imports. So we import the default session and the default profile and the default JWT from these libraries. And then we can go and augment some of these. So we can override the next auth module. And inside here, we can override the session. So we override the user part of the session object, and we augment that default session for the user with the roles. So we're adding roles basically into the user so that it exists, is what we're doing here. We can also override the profile so that it knows about this emails property down here. And then last but not least, we need to declare another module, which is the next auth JWT one, to augment the JWT. And inside here, we're just extending the default JWT and adding the roles, which is a string array or undefined, into there. So now when I save this, if we come back over here, we'll see that our red squigglies have all gone away, which is good. And then the last squiggly that we've got is this one on default. So we can go and expect an error there. You can look in the docs as to why this is the case. but that gets rid of our squiggly on there and makes everything nice and happy over here. So now that we've got our user roles, if I come over here as I'm logged in, I should be able to do API auth session, and this is the information I get back about my session. So I can see my roles collection is there, and because I'm logged in as an administrator, I'm a user and an admin. So let's go and create a composable called isAdmin. We just create our standard composable. We'll get the status of our session and any user data from our use session. We'll initialize some variable to false, and then if we are authenticated and we have our user has a roles collection on it, then we can interrogate that roles collection and set the isAdmin to true if it contains the admin entry, and then we can return that value back to our calling code. So that gives us a nice reusable composable, and again it's not use session now, it's use auth. And then to actually use this inside of our Vue, we can add a script block in here that uses that composable, sets up a variable if you are an administrator, and then inside of our Vue underneath account we'll just add a div that says if you're an administrator then we show I am an admin, just to illustrate the point. So let's save that and jump over here, and we see I am an admin, and then let's just log in with a different user. So someone who's not an admin, and we don't see our isAdmin. So that's our client side working correctly with our composable. So that's user authorization. So let's move on to how we can turn this authentication aspect into a fully blown BFF, so a backend for front end. So the other aspect of the backend for front end, as well as the auth aspect, is being able to proxy your requests, and if you're logged in and you're allowed to use the API, then you proxy requests across to further backend services and handle all of the authentication there. So what we're going to do is proxy a request across to another API through this particular backend API that we've got here. So inside of our API folder, let's go and add, as well as the auth, let's add a BFF folder so that it's nicely segregated away from our auth. And let's go and add another wildcard handler into that, and the default format for an event handler looks like that. Now what we need from the auth library is the get server session, so we will import that, and the reason that we're importing that is so that we can get hold of the session information about the user that's making this request. So what we can do is, if you don't have a session, we can create an error which is a 401 and say that you're not authenticated. So what that means is when I come over here, if I log out and I go to API BFF and some other URL like test, then that calls my BFF and returns me a 401 not authenticated, which is exactly what we want if you're not authenticated. Whereas if I log in and then go to, let's do it on another tab. So now I'm logged in as an authenticated user, I get a 404, which is okay because we haven't actually implemented anything to do with if you're logged in. So at this point here is where we're now up to. What we're going to do is we are going to get the rest of the URL out of the event. So this would be the /test. So if I come back over here, it's whatever I'm passing after BFF. That's what will be in this particular variable here. So I'm expecting that to tell me what service it is. But you can handle this however you want. But what I'm going to check for is if that comes in with a value of weather, then I'm going to call a weather service, and Otherwise, I am going to return null, and what returning null from a handler does is returns a 204. So if I save that, come over here and refresh, in fact, I won't see anything. So let's go on to the network tab and let's refresh that. And what you see is I got a 204, no content. So it's not going to change what's in the browser. This is the important bit. It is returning me a 204 because it doesn't match weather. So it's going to fall through and just return me a no content. But you are authenticated, so you're allowed to call the BFF is where we're going. So that's how I'm treating this service. Again, you can customize your BFF to work however you want it and return whatever status codes you want it to return. Now to handle calling the weather service. So I'm going to use the runtime config at this point, and we'll set that up in a bit. But my weather forecast API needs an API key. So I'm going to get that from the runtime config, and then I'm going to set up this URL and inject in that weather API key from my runtime config. So this is my API that I'm going to call, and I'm just going to get the weather for London. And then to actually make the call is very straightforward, and this is straight from the H3 examples. You can just call a composable called Proxy Request, and you pass on the event that's been fed into us up here, and you call the URL that you actually want to call. There is options on here so that you can do extra enhancements like enhancing the headers, etc., etc. If your API key needs to be in a specific header, you can handle all of that in there. But this essentially returns the result then back out of our API that we get from this weather API. So the last bit that I need to go and do is over in the Nuxt config, and in here we have our runtime config area, and I'm not going to put this in the public area because I only need this server-side API key, so I'm not exposing that to the client-side application. That's my API key that I can read, and this is a dummy one, so you won't get anywhere if you try and use this API key. But just to show you how you set this up, let's just tidy up that red squiggly. And so now if I do a test, I get my 204 coming back, and if I change this to weather, then I get a 200, and I've forwarded that request onto the weather API, and my BFF is looking like it now includes a weather API as part of it. So I could now write some front end that does a fetch on API BFF/weather, and then I can get out all of this information. So hopefully that shows you and you get the idea of how you can turn this into a fully blown BFF quite easily with just a simple server-side API call and some proxying across to wherever you want to go to. So that's it for this video. We've seen it's quite easy to add in a provider into the Nuxt Auth framework, and you can add as many providers as you like, and there are lots of providers as I showed earlier, so that's very easy to do. And then we also showed how you can extend that to then turn that into a fully blown backend for front end. So your front end is now nice and secure, and the token gets regularly refreshed from the server, and every time you go and do anything, you can get all the information out from that session endpoint that I showed you. So hopefully that gives you a good starting point around authentication, authorization, and creating your own BFF for your Nuxt application. Hopefully you found this useful, and if you did, then do remember to hit those thumbs up. It does really help me out, and it helps these videos reach more Nuxt developers so that we can expand the community. So smash that like button, and if you're not already subscribed, then why not smash that one while you're there. And again, thanks to my sponsors for sponsoring the channel. And with that, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.